Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Leah Martin walked into EC's auto repair that morning. She didn't clock in. She didn't clock out. Her purse stayed under her desk. Her truck never moved. And her baby girl? She waited for a mom who never came home. In a quiet Texas town, silence isn't just suspicious, it's fatal. This is the story of a woman who trusted the wrong men in a place she thought was safe and a garage that buried more than just secrets. Graham, Texas, a town with under 9,000 people and more pickup trucks than open secrets. It's the kind of place where the hardware store owner knows your kids' birthdays and folks still wave at strangers. But on May 29th, 2015, that familiarity cracked. A 22-year-old woman named Leah Martin vanished, not while out partying, not while driving on some isolated back road. She disappeared in broad daylight. At her job. At approximately 7:40 a.m., Leah was seen pulling into the parking lot of EC's auto repair where she worked the front desk. Her gray Dodge Dakota was found parked in its usual spot hours later, windows up, keys still on her ring. Inside the shop, her handbag was left beneath the counter. Cell phone still in it, nothing was stolen, nothing was broken. And Leah Martin, single mother, quiet employee, known face in Graham, was gone without a trace. It wasn't until nearly 5 p.m. that day that her mother dialed 911. Leah had missed daycare pickup. That was not like her. The dispatcher logged it as a welfare check. The responding deputy found the shop locked, the lights off, and the parking lot nearly empty. Just her truck. When they forced entry later that evening with the property owner's permission, nothing inside looked out of order. No blood, no signs of a struggle. Just an unfinished invoice at the front desk and a cold soda can on the counter. One detective would later say it was like she'd vaporized. There was no chaos, no panic, just vacancy. But to the family, something was immediately off. Leah didn't go anywhere without telling her mother or her sister. She had plans that weekend, a new apartment lined up, a dance recital to attend for her daughter, no missed payments, no pending threats, no reason to leave. And most of all, she wasn't the kind of mother to leave her child behind. What started as a missing persons report evolved by the next morning into something else. Officers canvassed the immediate area. No cameras pointed inside the garage, but across the street at a local credit union, the corner of EC's lot was visible. Footage from that Friday morning showed Leah's truck arrive. A few minutes later, a figure was seen entering the garage through the side gate. Hours passed. That figure never exited. There was no clear footage of Leah herself, just her vehicle. Just someone, possibly male, wearing what looked like a mechanic's uniform. The investigation began quietly. No press releases, no public plea for help. Graham police hoped it was a misunderstanding. Maybe Leah had gone somewhere unexpected. Maybe she'd be back Monday. She wasn't. 3 days later, her employer, Elton Carroll Blair, owner of EC's Auto Repair, was questioned. According to him, Leah had come in, picked up a few personal items, and left. He denied any conflict, claimed she didn't seem upset or stressed. He said she walked out smiling. That detail struck the detective as strange, because Leah's purse was still under the desk. Her car never left. Her phone wasn't used again after 8:11 a.m., a time consistent with the moment she arrived. There were no outgoing messages, no calls, no social media updates, and no movement on her bank account. For all digital traces, Leah Martin had simply gone silent, and that's when the department's tone shifted. Silent phones, unmoved vehicles, an abandoned purse. Those things alone don't mean murder, but they don't point to a woman who left voluntarily either, especially not one with a child waiting for her. They brought in her ex-boyfriend, Aaron Blair, the father of her daughter, and EC, Blair's adopted son. Aaron was cooperative, calm, offered an alibi, said he was working construction on a site 20 miles away. GPS data and co-workers confirmed it. He hadn't spoken to Leah in days. According to him, they shared custody and didn't communicate unless necessary. By June 3rd, Leah Martin had been missing for 5 full days. No ransom note, no signs of her crossing state lines, no communication, just nothing. But behind closed doors, her family began to speak freely about something they hadn't told the officers before. It turned out Leah hadn't just worked for E.C. Blair. According to her sister, Leah had been involved with him, romantically, even after breaking up with Aaron. The situation had caused tension. Leah's sister said Blair's wife had found out and confronted Leah weeks earlier. Since then, Leah had grown quieter, more careful. She kept telling her sister she needed to quit that job, but couldn't afford to. She was trying to line up a backup plan. Those details, once shared, gave the case a different weight. Now, this wasn't just a missing persons case. Now it was a workplace with interpersonal tension, hidden relationships, and a growing list of people with a reason to want Leah gone. But still, there was no physical evidence of a crime, no body, no blood, just suspicion. That changed on August 5th. It had been more than 2 months. A tip came in, unofficial, off-record, suggesting investigators search the backyard of a man named Ross Helms, a part-time worker at the garage. Helms had been quiet throughout the investigation. He hadn't lawyered up, hadn't said much of anything. But his name was listed as present on the work roster the morning Leah vanished. A search warrant was executed that afternoon. In the northeast corner of Helms' yard, near an unused backhoe, a shallow grave was uncovered. Inside, a human body wrapped in layers of plastic, duct tape around the head. A smell no detective ever forgets. Rocks were packed into the mouth cavity, a forensic signal often linked to attempts to prevent post-mortem gas buildup, or silence. Dental records confirmed it days later. The body was Leah Martin. What had once been speculation now had form, weight, evidence, but who had done it, and why, remained unproven. And as the dust of that discovery settled, more questions rose, the kind that don't get answered by accident, the kind that suggests someone out there knew far more than they had ever admitted. By the time Leah Martin's remains were identified in early August 2015, investigators were no longer asking if a crime had occurred, but rather who had both motive and means to carry it out. From the outside, EC's auto repair looked like any other small-town garage, an L-shaped cinder block building with 2 bays, 1 rusting sign, and a loyal client base. But from within the investigative lens, the garage was the central node in a network of complicated, overlapping relationships, personal, familial, and increasingly criminal. Leah wasn't just an employee. She had once dated Aaron Blair, the adopted son of garage owner Elton Carroll Blair, known locally as EC. According to family members, Leah and Aaron had been off and on for several years. Their daughter, born in 2013, was being co-parented between the two families at the time of Leah's disappearance. There was no ongoing custody battle, no history of violence between them, but there was something else, EC. Blair, a 67-year-old business owner with a reputation for giving second chances to ex-cons and dropouts, wasn't just Leah's former employer. He had allegedly become her secret partner. That revelation didn't come through a formal statement or affidavit. It came in the form of text messages Leah had sent to her sister weeks before she went missing. Screenshots showed Leah expressing concern that EC's wife had found out. The language was vague but emotionally clear. "He's freaking out," one message read. "Thinks I ruined everything." In another, "I need out of this job. I'm trying, but I can't just walk." She had apparently been saving to leave, but financial pressure kept her anchored at the front desk. That financial pressure would later become critical context. Leah had no history of drug use, debt collection, or instability. She was, by all accounts, quiet and responsible. Her bank statements showed regular income deposits from EC's auto repair, modest childcare expenses, and no signs of gambling or unusual withdrawals. She had recently applied for a rental property 30 miles away in Jacksboro, a lease she never finalized. Investigators now turned attention inward. If there had been a conflict at the shop, someone who worked there had likely known about it. They conducted re-interviews with all 3 male staff members listed on payroll that Friday morning: Ross Helms, Billy Minkley Jr., and EC de Blair himself. Ross said he hadn't seen Leah that day, claimed he'd been running errands off-site. When pressed for details, he became evasive about timelines, unable to provide receipts or GPS logs to support his claim. He did mention, offhand, that things had gotten weird lately, but didn't elaborate. At the time, that wasn't enough to hold him. Minkley's interview raised more concerns. A 35-year-old with a prior conviction for assault, he had worked for Blair for over a decade. He declined to give a formal statement but consented to a search of his vehicle. No evidence was found, But the interviewing officer noted that Minkley appeared cold and removed when asked about Leah. Not dismissive, but rehearsed. EC. Blair's own statement followed soon after. He confirmed that he was at the shop that morning and claimed Leah had stopped in, grabbed a small cardboard box with personal items, and left without saying much. Blair insisted he didn't know where she went. He said her leaving her purse behind must have been an oversight. When asked why she hadn't clocked in or been seen exiting, Blair blamed the broken surveillance system. "That camera's been out for months," he said. "We've been meaning to replace it." That camera, it turned out, had last logged activity in March and almost 3 months before Leah disappeared. Technically, nothing in Blair's story directly contradicted any hard evidence, but there were inconsistencies. Leah's phone, recovered from her purse, hadn't been used after 8:11 a.m., which aligned with the time she was believed to have arrived. Her car never moved from its parking spot. Her work computer hadn't been touched. There were no emails sent, no messages received. That digital vacuum triggered concern. One analyst remarked, "When a person stops leaving digital footprints and their body hasn't been found, we're either looking at someone who planned to vanish or someone who wasn't given a choice." The forensic review of her purse and belongings showed no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fibers. Her keys were clipped to her wallet. Her ID was in its usual sleeve. There were no wiped surfaces, no evidence of bleach or solvent. If the scene had been cleaned, it had been done without rushing. The first real lead came from Leah's sister, who had gone through some of Leah's notes and printed texts. A yellow legal pad was found at Leah's apartment, tucked behind a drawer in her bedroom, where she had apparently scribbled notes about her finances and job options. One phrase stood out in block letters. He said, "I'm making him look like a monster." The handwriting matched. The ink was dated, consistent with 2 weeks before her disappearance. At that point, investigators flagged the garage as a compromised zone, meaning any staff with inside access would be examined more closely. Cell tower data requests were filed for all 3 employees. The goal was to establish who was on site for how long and whether any movements after Leah's arrival contradicted earlier statements. The first report to come back was for Ross Helms. His cell pinged at a tower 3 blocks from the garage around 8:20 a.m. on May 29th. He claimed to have left town by that point. That contradiction triggered a subpoena for GPS records. The records would take another few days to process, but by then, the tone of the case had shifted from cautious inquiry to targeted suspicion. And at the center of that shift stood a woman who had been trying to leave quietly, only to disappear completely. At first glance, Ross Helms didn't draw much attention. He wasn't family. He didn't sign checks. He didn't raise his voice. He was a low-visibility mechanic at EC's Auto Repair, someone who handled the occasional tow, picked up parts, stayed off the books half the time. But by the second week of August 2015, Helms's name had moved to the top of the case board, not because of what he said, but because of what the data didn't match. Investigators had flagged all 3 employees who were reportedly present the day Leah Martin disappeared: Ross Helms, Billy Minkley Jr., and E.C. Blair. The forensic strategy at that point was to map movement, GPS triangulation, cellular ping history, and any point-of-sale data that could build or break an alibi. Ross told officers he was running errands for the garage that Friday morning, May 29th, said he never stepped foot inside the building, claimed he'd left town by 8:15 a.m. to pick up parts from a supplier an hour away. On paper, it sounded plausible. His bank statement showed a gas purchase that morning. The problem was the location. The gas station was in Graham, less than 4 miles from the garage, time-stamped at 9:04 a.m. That was the first inconsistency. Next came his cell data. With the assistance of Verizon Subpoena Compliance and the FBI's Cellular Analysis Survey Team, CAST, detectives plotted Ross's device movement across multiple towers. From 7:45 to 8:30 a.m., his phone was pinging from the tower nearest the garage. It then moved west, not toward a parts distributor, but back toward his own home. The phone signal dropped for nearly 2 hours after that. No calls, no data. Detectives called that a dark window. There was also a second problem. Ross had claimed he never interacted with Leah that morning, but a forensic review of Leah's work schedule showed that she was supposed to open the front desk, a job that normally didn't require access to the garage floor. For her to have entered alone, someone would have had to unlock from inside. The main bay door lock was only accessible from the shop's interior. Surveillance footage from across the street, grainy and partial, had already shown a figure entering the garage shortly after Leah's arrival. It wasn't possible to confirm that person's identity, but height, build, and general posture were consistent with Ross Helms. At this point, detectives brought in Billy Minkley again. He'd been guarded during the first interview. This time, the tone shifted. He was asked to explain his whereabouts during Leah's reported time of arrival. Minkley said he was in the storage shed behind the garage taking inventory. A search of that shed had already been conducted. No signs of recent use, no boxes moved, no materials logged. When confronted with that, Minkley offered no clarification. He simply said, "Then I guess I was wrong." Investigators noted the response. Flat, not defensive. Not helpful either. What stood out most, though, was the digital quiet. Both Minkley and Helms had sudden drops in cell activity during a critical window, 8:15 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. For men in working-class jobs, especially those coordinating deliveries or communicating with vendors, that type of blackout wasn't typical. One analyst put it this way: silence in cases like these isn't absence, it's intention. Search warrants followed. Helms' home was searched again, this time with specific focus on his backyard. A canine unit had been brought in days prior, but heavy rainfall that weekend had compromised the initial trace. Now, with cadaver dogs redeployed and new attention paid to disturbed soil and foliage patterns, they isolated an area behind his garage, near a stack of scrap material and a rusted-out backhoe. The following day, August 5th, the dig began. Within 90 minutes, a human-sized form wrapped in industrial-grade plastic was uncovered. Multiple layers. Duct tape sealed the edges. The odor confirmed what the dogs already knew. The body had been buried roughly 3 feet deep. The wrapping, consistent with materials stored at EC's Auto Repair, showed no fingerprints, no biological transfer on the outer layer. But inside, forensic teams recovered partial DNA matches on the tape. And the presence of rocks within the mouth cavity led the medical examiner to note this as deliberate post-mortem interference. The identification came quickly. Dental records, then soft tissue match. Leah Martin. The cause of death was ruled as blunt force trauma to the left temporal region of the skull. No defensive wounds, no hesitation marks. The autopsy estimated the time of death between 8:30 and 9:15 a.m., overlapping with the exact window where both Ross and Billy's digital traces had gone dark. At this stage, Graham police prepared for formal charges, but there was one more layer: the vehicle trace. Forensic technicians examined tire tracks leading from the alley behind Helms's house to the gravesite. A match was confirmed with the back tires of Ross's truck. Same tread pattern, same wheelbase. He had parked there 2 days earlier, said it was for clearing debris. That explanation no longer held. And yet, in every formal interview, Ross maintained he knew nothing about Leah's death. He claimed the burial wasn't his doing, that he'd been used. That's when his lawyer stepped in, and the interviews stopped. What came next would depend on one thing: whether anyone would finally tell the truth. Graham, Texas, summer 2015. The summer heat was just beginning to thicken in Graham, Texas, when the silence around Leah Martin's disappearance finally started to fracture. For weeks after her last known appearance on May 29, 2015, official progress had stalled. No body, no forensic scene, no witnesses stepping forward with anything that could survive courtroom scrutiny. The local department processed leads, but the trail remained dry. What shifted the entire investigation wasn't a confession, it was a calculation. A decision made under pressure. Billy Minkley, then a mechanic at EC's Auto Repair, reached out to law enforcement through an intermediary in early August. He didn't come clean out of remorse. He came forward because the weight of holding that kind of knowledge, combined with the clear risk of being thrown under the bus by co-conspirators, became too high to carry alone. According to investigators, Minkley's cooperation was strategic. He offered details in exchange for a reduced sentence. But what he shared wasn't just damning, it was anatomically specific. He told detectives that Leah had been killed inside the office at the auto shop, not outside, not abducted from the street, but right there, on site, where she worked. The detail was shocking and consistent with something investigators had quietly suspected. The garage's own interior may have been the initial crime scene. Minkley's statement described how Leah had been struck in the head with a crowbar while seated, caught completely off guard. She didn't scream, she didn't run. According to his account, she slumped to the ground without resistance. Ross Helms, another mechanic present that day, allegedly assisted in moving and disposing of her body. The level of coordination, the lack of hesitation, those were the elements that chilled detectives more than the brutality itself. Authorities requested a ground search warrant targeting a specific residential address, Ross Helms's home. The justification? Minkley claimed Leah's remains had been buried there in the backyard under freshly turned soil disguised by common trash. Excavation began in silence. Cameras were kept back. A small team from the Sheriff's Department and Texas Rangers moved in with forensic protocols. After hours of controlled digging, investigators found what appeared to be a plastic tarp. Inside, a human body, partially decomposed, wrapped in multiple garbage bags, tightly sealed with industrial tape. A large quantity of rocks had been placed inside the mouth cavity, an act that investigators later interpreted as symbolic, possibly intended to silence her, even in death. Fingerprint analysis and dental records confirmed the body as Leah Martin. Cause of death could not be conclusively determined due to decomposition, but blunt force trauma to the skull was consistent with Minkley's description. Her phone, purse, and personal effects were never recovered. The public was not informed immediately. Law enforcement needed time. They knew what this discovery implied, but they also knew who had yet to be charged. One detail stood out. When asked during interrogation why Leah had been targeted, Minkley didn't hesitate. She became too loud, he said. She was causing problems for EC. This statement forced investigators to scrutinize the role of EC, Blair, far more aggressively than before. Blair had motive, proximity, and according to the inner circle at the garage, absolute control. But having a motive isn't the same as having evidence. And in American courts, control doesn't equal conviction. Graham, Texas, August 2015. I remember the exact words an investigator used after stepping into the backyard of Ross Helm's property. There's silence, but it's not peace, it's weight. And in that weight, they uncovered what Leah Martin's family had feared for months. But while the body confirmed the worst, it was only the beginning of what law enforcement needed to prove what actually happened. And who ordered it? Leah's remains were transported under seal to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office. By this point, decomposition had advanced, accelerated by the summer heat and the conditions in which she'd been buried, wrapped in layers of plastic tightly bound with industrial-grade duct tape and encased in yard soil. The rocks forced into her mouth had not only left psychological questions, they also introduced physical complications to analysis. But forensic teams had seen worse, and they got to work. The autopsy did not yield a single cause of death with certainty, but it did reveal multiple skull fractures, consistent with blunt force trauma from a heavy object. That detail aligned precisely with Billy Minkley's confession. Leah had been struck in the head with a crowbar while seated. There were no defensive wounds, no evidence she ever saw it coming. Toxicology results were inconclusive due to decomposition. No signs of post-mortem dismemberment or additional trauma were observed. There were also no signs of recent sexual assault, which was crucial in narrowing down potential motives. This wasn't a crime of passion in the traditional sense. This was planned, efficient, controlled, and that brought everything back to motive. From the beginning, investigators believed Leah's romantic relationship with E.C. Blair was central to her disappearance. Blair, 56 at the time, wasn't just her employer. He was the adoptive father of her boyfriend and biologically the grandfather of Leah's young son. That relationship had detonated Blair's marriage and reportedly caused chaos within the workplace. According to employees, tensions had escalated in the weeks leading up to Leah's disappearance. She had allegedly threatened to go public with information that would ruin the garage and Blair himself. What that meant remained unclear, but it was enough to change her from a nuisance to a threat. Inside EC's auto repair, police executed a second warrant and took samples from the office where Leah was last seen. Despite the time elapsed and the space being cleaned regularly, luminol testing revealed irregular blotting along the floor tiles and lower wall panels. Further chemical processing indicated traces consistent with blood spatter patterns, low velocity, angled downward, suggesting a seated victim, struck from above. No DNA could be extracted. But the forensic mapping matched what Minkley described in his statement. The office chair Leah had used was no longer there. It had been replaced in June, weeks after her disappearance. Investigators later retrieved surveillance logs from a nearby scrapyard confirming a chair matching the description had been disposed of and crushed. While this wasn't conclusive, it added to a pattern. Cleanup, disposal, erasure. Then came the turning point. Ross Helms, under mounting pressure, finally agreed to cooperate. His deal wasn't a confession, it was a plea arrangement conditioned on corroboration. What he told police tracked nearly point for point with Minkley's account. Leah was killed inside the office. Her body was stored temporarily in a locked utility closet. That night, under Blair's direction, they used a garage truck to transport her to Ross's residence. Blair didn't drive, but he was present and giving orders, according to Ross. Still, presence isn't guilt. Orders aren't recordings. Prosecutors knew this. The DA's office in Young County faced an uphill battle. They had 2 confessed participants, physical evidence, and a body, but tying ECE Blair directly to the murder itself required either irrefutable proof or an irreplaceable witness, and the only witness who might have been irreplaceable had been buried for 3 months. By late August 2015, charges were officially filed against Billy Minkley and Ross Helms for the murder of Leah Martin. Both were arrested and booked without incident. But the public wanted more. The town talked in parking lots, diners, and church hallways. Everyone wanted to know one thing. Would Blair finally be charged? The answer came quickly. It wasn't until late August that investigators finally found what they had suspected all along. A cadaver dog, alerted behind EC's auto repair, just along the back property line near a gravel access path. It was a site previously overlooked due to its industrial clutter, rusted drums, old tires, and discarded oil-stained tarps. But when the soil was tested, the results came back consistent with human decomposition. The warrant was executed at 7:43 a.m. on a humid Thursday morning. The forensic recovery team began excavation by jackhammering a segment of concrete recently poured without proper municipal documentation. Beneath that concrete slab, exactly where the dog had indicated, they uncovered what no one in town wanted to believe: a body, wrapped in black plastic sheeting, bound with multiple layers of silver duct tape, and most disturbingly, a cluster of smooth river stones had been stuffed inside the mouth. The victim was confirmed to be Leah Martin through dental records. An autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma to the skull with 2 distinct impact sites, likely from a metal object with a narrow head, possibly a crowbar or tire iron. The state of decomposition was advanced, but not so far gone that key forensic markers were lost. But this wasn't just a hasty attempt to dump a body. The methodical burial beneath concrete, the suppression of odor with foam insulation, the calculated positioning behind the property. This was planned, controlled, premeditated. From a criminal investigation standpoint, this shifted the case from a missing persons file to a homicide with forensic integrity. Within 48 hours, a second search of employee lockers yielded critical evidence. A crowbar with deteriorated tissue residue was recovered from Billy Minkley's toolbox. Analysis confirmed it matched mitochondrial DNA belonging to Leah Martin. Billy Minkley was brought in for questioning again. This time, he cracked. After nearly 2 hours of controlled dialogue, he requested a cigarette break, standard interview technique. When he came back, he started talking. He described how weeks before Leah's disappearance, E.C. Blair had made multiple offhand remarks about how Leah was ruining everything. Blair never said, "kill her," but Minkley interpreted the message as unmistakable. According to the confession, Blair framed Leah as a liability, not just to the business, but to his marriage and reputation. He wanted her gone. On May 29th, Minkley said, Ross Helms distracted Leah at the front desk with a false claim about missing paperwork. As Leah turned her back to retrieve a form, Minkley struck her, hard, fast. She dropped instantly, he told investigators. She never screamed, never fought. They wrapped her body in industrial plastic, sealed it with tape, and carried her out after dark. The burial site had already been prepared. Minkley admitted Blair had given instructions about the gravel pour that was supposed to follow the next day, effectively hiding the site. Ross Helms was arrested the next morning. He refused to speak but did not request a lawyer. Soil samples from the floorboard of his pickup truck matched the burial site. Surveillance from a nearby hardware store confirmed that 2 sets of gloves and a bag of construction-grade duct tape were purchased by Helms the night before Leah vanished. At this point, the evidence against Minkley and Helms was overwhelming. Charges were filed. They were booked and held without bail. But E.C. Blair was different. Prosecutors believed he had orchestrated the killing. Yet they had no direct physical evidence tying him to the crime, no digital communications, no financial trail, only verbal implication, one step removed from hearsay. In the eyes of Texas law, that wasn't enough. As the DA prepared for trial, it became clear. The burden wasn't just proving that Blair was morally culpable. They had to prove that he solicited, planned, or facilitated the murder with criminal intent. Without a recording, a written order, or eyewitness testimony placing him at the scene, Blair was insulated. Still, the prosecution pressed forward. Leah Martin was dead, and someone had laid the foundation, figuratively and literally, for her disappearance. And in stories like these, there's always one question left in the air. How much power does a man really need before he believes he can erase someone? By the time Billy Minkley's confession was processed and recorded in full, the prosecution had the concrete evidence it needed to secure convictions for both Minkley and Ross Helms. But one name still loomed over every file, every court proceeding, every redacted memo. E.C. Blair, the man who owned the garage. The man whose personal entanglement with Leah Martin blurred the lines between employer, lover, and something far more insidious. From the outside, Blair remained composed, well-dressed, courteous in court, quiet when approached. But inside law enforcement circles, there was growing frustration. Investigators privately admitted, "We know he set it in motion, but knowing and proving are two different animals." What couldn't be ignored was the ripple effect of Blair's decisions. In the weeks following Leah's disappearance, surveillance footage surfaced from the EC's auto repair office, footage partially deleted, but partially recovered through a forensic tech hired by the DA's office. It showed Blair entering the office alone at 9:46 p.m. on May 29th, the same night Leah was reported missing. He stayed approximately 18 minutes. The camera feed cut out for 5 of those minutes. When it returned, Blair was seen exiting the garage holding a pair of gloves and a folded tarp. Still, that wasn't enough. It placed him at the scene, but not at the act. No witness placed him at the burial. No voice recording captured the alleged solicitation to kill. The case against Blair hung on the word intent, a concept the defense would later use to dismantle the prosecution's theory. Ross Helms, in contrast, never offered a statement, not one. His silence became his tactic. His defense argued that he was unaware of the murder plot and had only assisted in disposing of evidence under duress. The court didn't buy it. In September 2015, both Helms and Minkley were indicted for first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Minkley took a plea deal for life in prison. Helms went to trial and lost. He was convicted and sentenced to 45 years. His lack of cooperation became a nail in his own coffin, but it was E.C. Blair's trial that drew national attention. Reporters filled the courtroom. The press nicknamed him the Godfather of Graham, not just for his age and status, but for the eerie sense that he pulled strings others were too afraid to name. The prosecution relied heavily on Minkley's testimony. He described Blair's resentment toward Leah, calling her toxic, disruptive, and dangerous to the family. But under cross-examination, the defense chipped away at the credibility. Minkley had struck the fatal blow. Minkley had buried the body. Minkley had taken a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. And now he was pointing fingers. That was the defense's narrative. And it worked. There was no smoking gun, no text, no audio, no DNA of Blair at the burial site. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with a verdict of not guilty. Legally, E.C. Blair walked free, but the air in that courtroom was colder than any acquittal could thaw. The community knew what it knew, even if the law didn't. And perhaps the most disturbing truth was this: not all murders are carried out by those who hold the weapon. Sometimes it's the ones who issue the silence. Justice delivered, but not for everyone. In late 2024, nearly a decade after Leah Martin vanished from EC's auto repair in Graham, Texas, the final trial closed. The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned its verdict: E.C. Blair, not guilty of capital murder. For Billy Minkley and Ross Helms, the outcome had already been sealed. Both men were convicted and sentenced. Minkley for striking Leah with a crowbar, Helms for helping dispose of her body in his backyard. Their prison terms reflected the brutality of the crime. Leah, just 22, was wrapped in plastic, bound with duct tape, and buried with rocks in her mouth, a symbolic act to keep her quiet. What remained unresolved was Blair's alleged role. Minkley claimed Blair had pressured them, that Leah was too much trouble and needed to disappear. But the jury couldn't find definitive proof. No texts, no recordings, no financial trail. The burden of beyond a reasonable doubt wasn't met. The town of Graham didn't riot. It recoiled. For those close to Leah, the trial's outcome felt like legal closure, but moral failure. Her mother refused interviews. Her son, now growing up without answers, remains the final link to a story the courts could not fully explain. Leah's story stays with me, not just as a tragic crime, but as a reminder. In small towns or big cities, silence can be deadly. When we dismiss warning signs or overlook vulnerable voices, we risk letting harm grow in plain sight. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this: speak up, ask questions, and protect those without power. Because justice delayed is often justice denied. What do you think? Should E.C. Blair have been held accountable? Do you believe the system worked or failed? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you or made you think, let me know where you're watching from. And if you didn't like it, tell me why. Let's talk about it. If you're still here, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next real case we break down.